The night everything finally cracked open began like 1,000 other evenings I had endured without complaint, the kind that pass quietly and leave no mark until suddenly they don't. And when I walked into the winter gala hosted by my wife's firm at a luxury riverside venue glowing with gold light and artificial cheer, I had no idea I was about to witness the public end of a marriage I had already buried in private months before. My name is Marcus Hale, and at the time I was 53 years old, a logistics operations director at a regional manufacturing network called Northway Industrial, where I had spent over 2 decades ensuring that raw materials flowed seamlessly from suppliers to factories like blood through a body, unseen yet essential. My wife Clarissa was 49, charismatic, driven, and employed as a senior brand strategist at Crestfield Consulting, a firm obsessed with growth metrics, image, and executive loyalty. Together we had 2 children, Evan, 24, finishing his master's degree in data systems, and Leela, 19, preparing for her first year of university. We had arrived at the event separately because Clarissa claimed a late planning meeting kept her behind, though I suspected even then that the truth was something far more calculated. I stood near the refreshment table holding a glass of soda, watching strangers laugh too loudly and pretend the band mattered, when I saw her across the ballroom standing far too close to her department head, a man named Julian Mercer, whose polished smile and tailored suits gave the illusion of moral authority. They were touching in ways that had nothing to do with coincidence, and before I could even process the full implication of what I was seeing, she leaned forward, gripped his jacket collar, and kissed him in front of a room full of stunned witnesses. It wasn't subtle, wasn't mistaken, wasn't private. It was deliberate and theatrical, as though she wanted the world to see the statement she was making with her mouth and her body. Then she raised a glass and proclaimed something about leadership, confidence, and desire, her eyes meeting mine in challenge as if daring me to explode, to collapse, to give her the drama she believed she deserved. And instead I smiled, calmly set down my drink, and walked out while the band resumed and the party pretended nothing irreversible had just happened. The cold night air wrapped around me like a necessary shock, grounding me in the truth that the moment had arrived whether I had invited it or not. And as I stood beneath the glowing lights of the venue entrance, watching my breath cloud the air, I reached into my coat and removed my phone, not in anger, not in panic, but with a kind of quiet finality that had been building for months. The message I sent had been drafted long before that evening, waiting patiently for the undeniable proof I knew Clarissa would eventually provide, because patterns of deception always grow bolder before they collapse. The subject line was neutral, professional, impossible to ignore, and the attachments included files I had gathered through careful observation and legal access. Recorded conversations, financial records, internal emails, and footage that showed more than an affair. It revealed breaches of confidentiality, conflicts of interest, and corporate misconduct that had the power to dismantle careers. I sent the message to a single recipient who I knew would act without hesitation, then slid the phone back into my pocket and drove home in silence while inside the ballroom Clarissa continued her performance, unaware that the future she had taken for granted was already dissolving. She would return hours later believing the night had been bold, rebellious, empowering, never suspecting that the true consequence of her actions would not arrive through confrontation, but through systems far larger and far less forgiving than our marriage. I remained awake long after midnight, sitting in the dim light of my home office, watching the driveway through the blinds as if waiting for confirmation that the life I had lived for nearly 20 years was finally over. And when Clarissa's car finally pulled in, I observed her stumble out in heels no longer glamorous under the harsh motion lights, her red dress wrinkled and her confidence already fading beneath exhaustion. She didn't call for me or check to see if I was home. She simply went upstairs, closed the door, and collapsed into sleep as though nothing remarkable had occurred. I waited. At exactly 3:41 in the morning, her phone rang, the sharp tone she reserved for important contacts, and I heard her voice shift from confusion to alarm to panic in the span of seconds, followed by hurried footsteps and the unmistakable sound of her laptop booting up. I rose calmly, walked into the kitchen, and prepared coffee with deliberate care, measuring, pouring, pressing the button as the machine hummed to life, grounding myself in routine while her world was unraveling above me. When she came downstairs moments later, pale and shaken, clutching the computer like armor, she stared at me as if I were a stranger, and when she asked if I had sent something to Julian, I replied only by asking what he had told her, watching her fear grow as she opened the message and saw the attachments she hadn't yet dared to access, knowing that the truth inside would change everything. She demanded explanations, raised her voice, accused me of betrayal, but I remained steady, reminding her that evidence does not exist to punish. It exists to reveal, and that for months she had been living a double life without realizing how transparent it truly was. I told her that I had reached out to someone else who had been deceived by Julian as deeply as I had been by her, and together we had compared notes, discovered patterns, and assembled the full scope of misconduct that neither of them had anticipated would ever be exposed. Clarissa collapsed onto the couch, her certainty evaporating as she realized this was not simply about infidelity, but about violations that would ripple through entire corporations, regulatory bodies, and professional networks. She pleaded, cried, promised to change, but I told her that the moment she made our marriage a spectacle, she had made this outcome inevitable, and that what followed was not revenge, it was consequence. As her phone began to ring again with incoming calls from frantic colleagues, I left her sitting alone in the dark, finally understanding that sometimes silence carries more weight than any argument ever could. The following morning arrived gray and heavy with rain, and I dressed for work as I always had, though the life waiting for me beyond the front door was no longer the same. And as I drove through slick streets toward the industrial campus where I had built my career, I reflected on the invisible systems I had maintained for decades, the vendor relationships, compliance frameworks, and emergency protocols I understood more intimately than anyone else in the organization. My office overlooked the shipping docks, a quiet vantage point where I had once felt pride, and it was there that I opened a document and began drafting my resignation. Not immediate, but strategic, citing a rarely used clause in my contract that granted me oversight authority during extended transitions, allowing me to review and pause supplier agreements at my discretion. It was a safeguard no one remembered, buried deep within legal text, but it gave me the leverage I needed to ensure that the same systems I had protected could now demand accountability from those who had abused them. Before I could finish, a woman appeared at my door, her presence both unexpected and deeply connected to the chaos unfolding. Someone who had also been harmed by Julian's actions, someone who carried proof that transformed suspicion into certainty. And when she placed a data drive on my desk and told me what it contained, I realized the story was far bigger than I had imagined. Inside those files were communications that revealed insider knowledge being traded like currency, strategic decisions shared long before approval, and Clarissa's name threaded through conversations she could no longer deny participating in. And as I absorbed the magnitude of what I held, I felt not triumph, but gravity, because this was no longer about two people who had broken trust. It was about systems corrupted by arrogance and entitlement. The woman left, her part finished, and I sat alone processing the realization that my son had unknowingly helped expose the truth, having discovered digital traces and shared them with someone who believed justice mattered more than silence. I watched dominoes begin to fall as suppliers paused shipments, internal reviews were triggered, and executive offices descended into damage control, each action confirming that what I had set in motion could not be stopped, only endured. Clarissa's professional world was collapsing, and with it, the carefully constructed illusion that had once justified her choices. Our daughter learned the truth through whispers and headlines, her anger directed at me for allowing the consequences to become public. And when she confronted me, I explained that accountability does not originate from exposure, but from the actions that require it, though she struggled to accept a reality that fractured her sense of family and stability. My son stood beside me, resolute despite the emotional cost, while Clarissa attempted to manipulate him into undermining what had been revealed, proving that even in collapse, she clung to control. When I submitted my resignation and invoked the transition clause, leadership realized too late that the infrastructure they relied upon had been built on trust they had never fully earned. And as vendor contracts stalled and product launches faltered, the cost of ignoring ethics became impossible to ignore. The narrative shifted from scandal to systemic failure, and the corporations involved distanced themselves from those at the center, sacrificing reputations to preserve their own. Legal proceedings followed swiftly, with lawsuits alleging disclosure violations, financial damages, and breaches of fiduciary duty. And as attorneys prepared depositions, I remained focused on facts, on documentation, on truth unembellished by emotion, even as I grappled privately with the devastation my family was experiencing. Clarissa lost her position, her credibility, and the future she had envisioned. And though I refused to shield her from the results of her choices, I also refused to allow her to become a cautionary tale for our children, establishing a small trust to ensure she could survive while rebuilding what she had destroyed. When she came to me in desperation, I offered not reconciliation, but closure, explaining that love without respect cannot sustain a marriage, and that consequences, though painful, are necessary to restore integrity. Months passed, then a year, and in time we each found our footing in new realities shaped by truth rather than illusion. And as I stood outside a smaller home filled with fresh beginnings, watching my children move forward with cautious hope, I understood that what I had lost was not a family, but a version of it that had been built on compromise and silence. What I gained was self-respect, clarity, and the courage to choose honesty over comfort. And though the path had been steep and unforgiving, it led me to a place where peace felt possible again. The quiet that settled over my life after everything collapsed was not the peaceful silence I had imagined, but a fragile stillness, the kind that only comes after a storm has ripped apart every structure you thought would protect you. And in the weeks that followed the corporate investigations, legal depositions, and media speculation, I found myself walking through rooms that felt unfamiliar, as if the walls still echoed with arguments that no longer had a place in my future. I spent long mornings reorganizing files, closing accounts, and finalizing the transition notes that would soon be handed to a stranger who could never fully understand the systems I had spent a lifetime building. And while my former colleagues whispered and speculated about motives and loyalties, I focused instead on maintaining professionalism, reminding myself that my identity was not defined by the collapse of a marriage or the scandals surrounding it, but by the integrity I chose when tested. My children watched me carefully during this time, uncertain which version of their father would remain, and I made a conscious effort to show them consistency, to prove that resilience was not about control, but about adapting with dignity when control is no longer possible. Clarissa's world, once dominated by ambition and admiration, had narrowed into a sequence of legal meetings, therapy sessions, and job applications that were met with silence or polite rejection. And although I had prepared myself for this outcome, seeing the reality of her struggle forced me to confront the uncomfortable truth that accountability often arrives wearing the face of suffering, a truth that does not excuse wrongdoing, but challenges our capacity for empathy. Our interactions became brief and restrained, limited to logistical matters involving the children, and while resentment lingered beneath every exchange, it gradually softened into something quieter, less volatile, shaped by the understanding that we were no longer adversaries but two people navigating the consequences of irreversible decisions. She no longer spoke with the confidence that once defined her, and though she never fully admitted her role in the larger scandal, her silence acknowledged what words could not repair. As spring approached, the world outside seemed eager to move forward even when I still felt anchored to the weight of everything that had happened, and I found myself walking through parks, sitting in cafes, and reintroducing myself to the rhythms of a life no longer tethered to crisis management or emotional negotiation. The absence of constant tension allowed me to reflect on the years I had spent prioritizing stability over fulfillment, mistaking endurance for love, and ignoring the subtle erosion of trust that had begun long before the night of public betrayal. I began to recognize that the systems I had built in my professional life had always been about balance, redundancy, and transparency. Yet I had failed to apply those principles within my own marriage, believing that silence was a form of protection rather than a symptom of decay. My son settled into a new role that challenged his intellect and strengthened his independence, calling me regularly to share his progress, his doubts, and his growing confidence in a world that finally felt aligned with his potential. And through our conversations, I sensed his relief that the truth was no longer hidden beneath polite denial. My daughter, slower to forgive, carried her anger like a shield, oscillating between blame and longing, and I learned that healing does not follow a predictable timeline, that it requires patience without expectation and love without conditions. We spoke often about boundaries, honesty, and the courage to speak when silence feels safer. And though she struggled to reconcile the image of her mother she once admired with the reality she now faced, I reminded her that complexity does not erase compassion, and that people are more than the worst choices they make. In the absence of constant crisis, I turned inward, exploring interests I had neglected, reconnecting with friends I had slowly distanced myself from, and learning to enjoy my own company without the distraction of obligation or guilt. And as the days passed, I realized that independence is not a rejection of connection, but an affirmation of self-worth. I began to understand that respect is not demanded through fear or control, but earned through consistency, honesty, and the willingness to confront discomfort rather than conceal it. And this realization reshaped the way I approached every relationship in my life, from colleagues to family to strangers who briefly intersected with my story. The legal proceedings eventually reached their conclusion, bringing with them a sense of finality that felt both relieving and unsettling, as if the last chapter of a long book had been closed, while the characters remained suspended in the aftermath of their choices. Financial settlements were reached, reputations were quietly dismantled, and organizations issued carefully worded statements designed to restore public trust. And though the world moved on, I remained aware that the ripple effects would continue shaping lives long after headlines faded. Clarissa found work in a quieter environment, one that demanded humility rather than ambition, and while she never returned to the professional stature she once enjoyed, she slowly rebuilt a sense of purpose rooted in service rather than status. With time, my children began to see that the choices I made, though painful, were not acts of cruelty but declarations of self-respect. And as they grew into their own identities, I watched them develop a deeper understanding of accountability, empathy, and the courage required to choose truth over comfort. We spoke openly about mistakes, about forgiveness that does not erase responsibility, and about the importance of recognizing when a chapter must end for another to begin. And through these conversations, I discovered that the legacy I wanted to leave was not one of control, but of clarity, not one of perfection, but of integrity. There were moments when memories resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by music, familiar streets, or the scent of coffee in the early morning. And though nostalgia attempted to soften the past, I reminded myself that longing does not change reality, and that growth requires the willingness to release what no longer serves who you are becoming. I learned to honor the lessons without romanticizing the pain, to acknowledge the beauty that once existed without denying the harm that followed, and to embrace a future defined not by what was lost, but by what was discovered through resilience. As the seasons changed, so did my understanding of freedom, recognizing that it is not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of choice, and that true independence emerges when we no longer seek validation from those who cannot honor our worth. I cultivated friendships that celebrated authenticity, pursued work that aligned with my values, and found solace in the quiet routines that grounded me in the present rather than anchoring me to the past. And with each passing day, I felt a renewed sense of agency that affirmed the difficult path I had chosen. The story of my marriage became a chapter rather than a definition, a reminder of the importance of boundaries, communication, and self-respect. And while I could not change what had happened, I could choose how it shaped the person I became, using the experience as a foundation for deeper understanding rather than a source of bitterness. I learned that forgiveness is not a single moment, but an ongoing decision, one that evolves as we grow, and though some wounds may never fully disappear, they can become markers of strength rather than scars of regret. In the end, I found that peace does not arrive with grand gestures or dramatic resolutions, but with quiet acceptance, steady growth, and the courage to live authentically. And as I looked toward the future, I felt gratitude for the clarity that emerged from chaos, for the lessons hidden within loss, and for the opportunity to build a life grounded in respect, truth, and the unwavering belief that even after everything breaks, something meaningful can still be created from the pieces left behind.